So welcome everybody here. My name is Father Patrick Soll. I'm a Jesuit and professor for metaphysics and medieval philosophy here at the Munich School of Philosophy. And it's a great pleasure for me that this evening, despite of the fact that we are very close to Christmas, it's a really pleasure for me that you're here and that we have here Dr. Robert McNamara, who was willing to come to talk to us. And it's a great pleasure and honor because he's professor for philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville. Associate serious editor of Edith Stein studies, an associate scholar of the Hildebrand Project, an associate member of faculty of the International Theological Institute at the Maryvale Institute, and a founding member of the Aquinas Institute of Ireland. So, and as you probably know, since you're here and interested in this kind of talk, he's really one of the specialists, leading specialists of the thinking, not only of Aquinas, but especially of Edith Stein, which I think is a very interesting figure for a lot of reasons, because she was one of the first professional members in professional philosophy as a female student in the 20th century. She also converted from Judaism to Christianity, and then she was an assistant of Husserl, Edmund Husserl, who was one of the most important founding members of the phenomenological movement in the 20th century. And then she entered into the Carmel, became a nun, and finally she was murdered in Auschwitz. So quite a vita, quite a life. And Professor Robert McNamara studied extensively, published extensively also on Edith Stein, and just to keep it very briefly, he published numerous articles on Edith Stein, but just to mention one thing, I really recommend to your book list and reading list his, it's a dissertation, right? It's called The Personalism of Edith Stein, a synthesis of Thomism and phenomenology. And I invited him here because I think it's very interesting that he gives us, from his perspective, a brief summary of his research, of his thinking of Edith Stein. And just briefly how we do it, I think the talk will be around 50 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A, where we can engage a little bit more in a dialogical way, right? Well, and as you see here behind me, the last thing I want to mention, next year we're celebrating 100 years of this institution. And you can say you have little leaflets there, which you can take with you, and you're warmly invited to some of the events we will have next year. For example, we have a public talk of Anna Marmodoro. We have other events here. So just look at the leaflet and feel most welcome to participate in that. So Robert, thank you very much that you made your way to us, and the stage is yours. Thanks for your coming.
Just while my laptop starts, I'm from Ireland originally, but I now live in the United States with my wife and our 4 children. But for the past year and a half, I've been in Austria because we have a small study abroad campus there. And so I've been covering for one of the teachers on that campus. I'm learning German, but not quickly enough. I can reasonably well read it, but I can't speak it so well. So I'm thankful to you today that I get to speak to you in English. Can you hear me? Okay. As Father Patrick mentioned, I should definitely know that because Patrick is such an Irish saint for us. As Father Patrick mentioned, I'll speak for 45 or 50 minutes or so from a paper I have, which is more or less a summary of a certain aspect of the book. and then we'll open up for questions and dialogue, and that will probably be the most engaging and interesting part of it. So I'd encourage you as I speak to notate your questions or consider what you'd like to talk about after the formal section of the talk. So, Phenomenological Thomism, a Steinian perspective, or through the eyes of St. Edith Stein. Let's begin with thinking about thought in general. What does one do when there is philosophical discord, perhaps differences, contrasts, or disagreements? Or, less controversially, what does one do when attempting to appropriate a new theory, method, or notional framework? Or, more prosaically, though no less importantly, when one simply wants to learn something new, perhaps attain a new understanding or a fresh way of thinking. One way of approaching each of these questions and many others, is to come from the perspective of concepts, what we could in general call ideas that we produce in order to grasp anything whatsoever. This is a helpful approach because we are all evidently in possession of dissimilar concepts, dissimilar ideas or notions about the world in which we inhabit. We have dissimilar worldviews. This experience of contrast and disagreement highlights for us this dissimilarity of concepts. Concepts are like the intellectual equipment by which we grapple with the world. As rational and free, we are not mere mirrors of reality. Rather, we are engaged in wresting truth from reality. And the way we wrest it, for Stein and for Aquinas, is by concepts. Now, by highlighting these differences, I'm not signaling for you anything essentially problematic or negative, at least initially, for we have a perfectly natural way to overcome our dissimilarity of worldviews, that is, by dialogue. Dialogue gives us an opportunity to clarify our differences before ideally moving toward a common understanding, at least with respect to the area discussed, and of course only if we enter upon that path with genuine search for truth in mind. Dialogue then also provides us with opportunities to appropriate something new theories, new methods, new frameworks, while also learning from others and thereby expanding our grasp of reality. By dialogue, our worlds collide, and we come through that collision with a more expansive grasp of the world in which we inhabit. Of course, by dialogue here, I'm obviously not speaking merely about conversation, something second personal, live, and synchronous. Rather, I'm speaking about all modes of communication, and especially those that can be objectified in such things as books, audio, and video. Because of this objectification of thought, we can make contact with the great minds of humanity in much higher numbers, and even those separated by distance and time. This then means that we can share the same world with one another at this moment in human history, and also throughout all of human history, even to our most distant ancestors. Now, it is precisely with this last point that we come to the theme of the talk tonight, Phenomenological Thomism, where, with the help of St. Edith Stein, we will explore the potentially fruitful synthesis of a contemporary method of philosophy, phenomenology, and a medieval scholastic doctrinal philosophy and theology, that of Thomism. Now, to begin, let us set what we've explored so far in more technical garb, with a more technical rigor. Stein classifies the teaching she engages with the phrase conceptual apparatus. A conceptual apparatus is comprised of sets of concepts and conceptual interconnections. These are developed by some or other philosophical tradition as a way to identify and explicate the area under investigation. Conceptual apparatus are products of the human mind. They help us to grapple with what we initially apprehend and attain some degree of understanding of that which lies before us. And this is true whether we think of our apprehension as intuitive in a phenomenological vein or as abstractive in a Thomistic vein. Whenever we apprehend anything whatsoever, our conceptualization completes our apprehension when we take hold of the object or objects thought about. It is, so to speak, the hand of the mind whereby we reach out and grasp reality, to use an image of Aristotle. Now, when we have a complex area of investigation, we not only think of particular kinds of things, and therefore form particular kinds of concepts, rather we think about their conceptual interconnections, and we arrange these for ourselves in this conceptual apparatus. The apparatus can then be expressed by any media of communication, expressed by verbalized words, and thereby become a common intellectual inheritance. Now, this intellectual heritage we're all familiar with. We can think of it as Platonism and Aristotelianism, or Thomism and Scotism. Each of these schools or traditions or movements of philosophy grapple with the world in a different way, sometimes with difference, contrast, and even disagreement. What do we do with these differences? What do we do when phenomenology meets Thomism? Let me just get a read for a moment. Would you like me to continue to read from the paper or just speak about this? Just speak about it? I think that would be more comfortable. I'm looking at you and I think perhaps the paper is too formalized. Let's just talk. So let's just begin afresh. We all think differently about the world. Why is it that we think differently about the world? Why, as rational beings, has God set us in this created reality with all its wondrous density, and yet we grapple with it differently? Well, one of the reasons, of course, is that we can enter into dialogue with one another, and thereby attain a communal understanding. But we also see in this gap that we're not mere mirrors, as I mentioned, of reality. Rather, we're freely engaged with the world, and we have to wrest from it an understanding. Now, the term that captures that grappling with reality is the concept. Conceptus in Latin, Begriff in German. Forgive my German pronunciation, by the way. I read it, I don't frequently speak it. Now here we're going to discuss a particular philosophical problem, the controversy of a contemporary method of philosophy, phenomenology, meeting a late medieval way of thinking about reality, that is, the one crafted by Aquinas and passed on to us in the tradition of Thomism. Stein herself pretty much charts this course for us by the way of her life. Thank you. How does she do so? Well, she's initially formed in the phenomenological method under its founder, Edmund Husserl, at the turn of the 20th century. However, through her philosophical investigations and other personal aspects of her life, including meeting with many other Christians, she converts to Catholic Christianity and then discovers that she needs to intellectually grapple with its thought world. What is a Catholic worldview? And she says, as a matter of course, I therefore came across St. Thomas Aquinas, who is, as we know, a figure that stands tall in the Catholic intellectual tradition. So she has this modern, contemporary way of viewing reality, a methodological device that provides great rigor, and now she has to get to grips with this ancient tradition, a tradition that goes back to Jerusalem, a tradition that goes back to Athens, a tradition that was synthesized in the 13th century by Aquinas, and now has to be resynthesized anew in the contemporary age under her hand. So, after initially giving up philosophical exploration for the course of nearly 10 years, she returns to philosophy to have a confrontation between modern philosophy and the philosophy of medieval scholasticism. You could say the philosophy of the modern university and the philosophy of the Catholic Church. Now, the way she does so is she approaches it from this perspective of concepts. She's going to take the Thomistic conceptual worldview into her understanding, and she's going to apply the phenomenological method to see if these concepts fit reality. That is, if they pattern the things that lie before her. Now, how many of you here are familiar with phenomenology? A little discursus on it before we proceed. So it's a contemporary method of philosophy that helps us to grapple with the things themselves. That's the famous rally cry of phenomenology, an attempt to grapple with the things themselves. And how it does so is it attends very closely to experience, conscious experience, and helps us to unpack or unfold the full contents of conscious experience. And so everything that we know has this basis in experience. This is something that Aristotle thought. This is something that Aquinas thought. This is something that phenomenology thought. However, phenomenology is a caution in doing so. It says we ought not to grant metaphysical judgments. We ought not to take it that reality is real because that's a metaphysical judgment. We're just going to unpack the contents of experience. And then also, we ought not to adopt into our understanding any other movement or school or tradition without first thinking it through for ourselves. Now, Stein is going to give us a slight adjustment of the phenomenological method. She's going to grant reality has existence independent from the mind. Why? Because the things are given to us in experience. And she's also going to adopt teachings from prior philosophical traditions, in this case, Thomism. Why? Well, because she does recognize that those who have gone before us must have thought to some degree clearly about reality, and therefore should be respected as giving us this intellectual inheritance. St. Thomas stands tall in the Catholic tradition, and because of that, he's a touch point for the tradition. For Stein, she goes before him as a reverent and willing pupil. She thinks that he's synthesized revelation with ancient Greek and Roman thought, as well as the thought of the Church Fathers and the early medieval era. She said he'd received a mind that has a wondrous clarity, and consequently she gives herself over to his thought, yet not in such a way that she's happy to just take it in and repeat it to the next generation. Rather, because she had this profound intellectual integrity, she was going to think about it for herself. She was going to think through the Thomistic conceptual worldview and see if it was true. And she's going to do so with the methodological rigor of phenomenology. Now, we could call this a testing of the conceptual worldview of Thomism, of St. Thomas and Thomism. Now, instead of going through any more of this methodological aspect, let's move into some of the teachings that she taught her way through, because here's where it becomes most interesting. Now, the area of her thought that I'm most familiar with is her personalism, and so she could be considered a Thomistic personalist. So we're going to consider some doctrines of St. Thomas in relation to the human individual as a person and consider them together with Stein and see if she clarifies reality for us. Now, this is the important point. When we think through something, we see whether or not it's true inasmuch as the world becomes more clear for us, inasmuch as reality is clarified and rendered more precise. Many of you tonight are wearing glasses, like myself. You know that when you take them off, the world is quite vague. It has been rendered inchoate. I can't see the edges of things anymore. Colors are not as vibrant. Then I put my glasses on, and all of a sudden the world comes into high resolution for me. Now, a good doctrine will do that for us, not for the eye of the body, but for the eye that is the mind. When we receive good teaching, the world becomes more clearly refined. The world becomes more vibrant and colorful. So we're going to think tonight, with the help of St. Edith Stein, about the doctrines of St. Thomas Aquinas in relation to the person, and see if they bring the person into higher resolution. See if it's like putting on glasses. The first thing, St. Thomas has adopted a classical definition of the person, the Boethian definition. So St. Boethius was the first person to give us a definition of what it means to be a person. Interestingly enough, the term person develops slowly throughout human history and only takes on its fully clarified sense in the contemporary and modern eras. Now, Boethius' definition of the person is an individual substance of a rational nature. The person is an individual substance of a rational nature. Now, we can break this definition into two parts. An individual substance. It's dignified to have existence, to stand in being as a substance. For St. Thomas, substances are the primary bedrock of reality. The world is constituted out of a plurality of substances. These are all individual things, and they all stand in being, and because of this, they all have value. But there's a particular kind of substance, the rational substance, that is a substance with a rational nature that doesn't just have value, but has the kind of value we call dignity, that is an exalted value. Dignity is an incommensurable value. So think of like a priceless work of art. When we speak about a work of art as priceless, what are we saying? We're not saying it's worthless, we're saying it's beyond the standard of price. There isn't a euro value for this work of art because it's beyond the standard of price. So its value is so exalted we can't measure it. Persons are beings of dignity. We can't give a dollar or euro value for a person. And this is very clearly in the fact that we all have a repugnance against the phenomenon of slavery. We can't trade in human persons. Why do persons bear this dignity, this exalted value? Because they're rational. Now, St. Thomas helps us to really understand this, because when we think of rationality today, we often think of it in a caricature form. That is, we often think of rationality as an ability to quantify, to calculate, to measure, to logically process, because we live in a rationalistic age. But for the ancients and the medievals, rationality was our ability to become one with reality. For Aristotle, knowledge is the union of knower and known. So this capacity we have is a capacity to become one with the world. And this capacity is so expansive that given an endless series of time, each of us here could come and encapsulate the whole of the cosmos with our rationality. But this is not what St. Thomas focuses on. St. Thomas focuses on the freedom that follows upon rationality. Only because we're rational can we attain truth, and only because we can attain truth can we be free. So let's think of just a very ordinary, concrete example for this. There are two doors, actually there are three, but let's say there are two doors at the back of the hall. Behind one door is heaven, and behind the other door is hell. And I command you this moment to go out one of those doors. What do you do? Likely you'd ask me which door is heaven and which door is hell, yeah? Because you'd have to know behind which door to choose freely what you would do next. So you see here that truth makes us free. It's a very basic example. We could enumerate many other examples. Truth renders us free. When Christ says in the Gospels that truth shall set you free, he's not just speaking about himself as the way, the truth, and the life. Rather, he's speaking something metaphysical. The Gospels are metaphysically robust. Truth makes us free. Now, it's this freedom that makes us of immeasurable value, at least for St. Thomas, because he tells us that the word person has been coined historically to signify rational substances because they have dominion over their own actions. Each of us are lord of our own acts. We have dominion over our own actions. We have the freedom to determine our choices. And this freedom to determine our choices means that our actions are our own. They're not merely the actions of a human individual, an individual of the human kind, an action of human nature, you could say, but rather your actions are your actions and my actions are my actions. If I act, it's certainly the action of a human, but not merely the action of a human, it's the actions of Robert. If Father Patrick acts, it's not merely the actions of a human, it's the actions of Father Patrick. And so you see that then when we have this rational substance, access to truth, and correspondingly freedom, we have beings of great dignity because they are the source of their own actions. Now, in this nexus is found our creativity. God is first and foremost creator, and we who have been made to his image are also creators. We have creativity, and our creativity comes through this access to truth and this ability to freely act in the world. Stein exhibits this wonderfully in her own life. The path of her life leads her from truth to truth, such that she's willing to sacrifice her life for the sake of truth. Now, if we think of that for a moment, the idea of martyrdom, it's very strange on a naturalistic or materialistic level. Body death means the end of life. And if you're naturalistic or materialistic in your understanding, that's the end of you. But because we've access to truth and corresponding to this freedom, we have an ability to sacrifice our body life for the sake of truth, which is precisely what she did. And in this you find an exalted exercise of freedom. Now, Stein receives this understanding of the person from Aquinas, but she gives it a characteristic adjustment from the perspective of contemporary philosophy. Through her phenomenological explorations, she alights upon a structural component of the person that St. Thomas or Boethius did not include in the definition. And that structural component she calls the conscious I. This is something she receives from Husserl. Husserl typically calls it the pure I. For Stein, the I is the centerpiece of the person. Interestingly, our grammar takes shape from this centerpiece. The word I in English, the corresponding word in German, captures for us this conscious freedom that we exercise in the world. I is an interesting word. I look out upon you, I am aware of you, and at the same time, I am concomitantly aware of myself. I am aware that I am aware of you. This is a really interesting phenomenon. In this, Stein finds the heart of spirit, that is, an ability to go out to the other in awareness while remaining present to oneself in self-awareness. And it's all captured by this simple personal pronoun, I. So, we can then adjust our understanding of the person from the perspective of this centerpiece and say the person is an individual substance of a rational nature born by a conscious I. The conscious I for Stein is the luminous apex of personal life. It's where we arise to awareness of ourselves and one another. It's where we encounter the world. It's where we encounter the other in the world and at the same time ourselves. Now, just for a moment, think what you would be if I was to take away your awareness and your self-awareness. What would be left of you if your awareness and self-awareness were suddenly erased. It seems like nothing would remain. You'd still be an individual substance, a bodily material whole. You'd still have operations of life. But we couldn't really consider our rationality anymore. Thinking is never just thinking, it's always someone thinking. And for Stein, there's this structural centerpiece, the I, that wields the power of thought. So we adjust the definition then, an individual substance of rational nature born by a conscious I. Now, when we move toward an understanding of the individual, this becomes a little bit more compelling for us, or a little bit more interesting. That is, St. Thomas taught that we were individual by virtue of the body. Following the tradition of Aristotle, where matter individuates, then we have the individuals of the same species because we're bodily beings. Interestingly, for St. Thomas, angels were not beings that shared a species. Angels stood singularly in reality, exhausting their species. But we are multiple members of the human species, multiple members of the human race, and famously for St. Thomas, following Aristotle, it was the matter of the body that individuated us. Now, Stein couldn't accept this doctrine of Aquinas, and the reason she couldn't accept it is because she took this perspective upon the person from the perspective of the conscious I. Each of us, with ourselves, can distinguish ourselves from everything else, from all else actual and possible, because we have this awareness and self-awareness. Each of us is utterly distinct in consequence of this conscious I that is aware and self-aware. And so Stein proposes then that our being individual cannot be reduced to the matter of the body, but rather is something of us because we're personal spirits. And the apex of personal spiritual life for Stein is this conscious I. Now, her doctrine takes us further than this. And this, I think, is perhaps where it will come a little bit compelling for you. Just like St. Thomas, Stein was a wonderful synthesizer of that which came before her. And so she synthesized the ancient and the medieval and the modern and contemporary traditions. And therefore she took St. Thomas and St. Augustine together, and as well as that Aristotle and Plato together, and as well as that the Carmelite mystic tradition, and she considered what it means to be a spiritual soul. And so she describes the spiritual soul then, just like St. Teresa of Avila does, as an interior castle. And this interior castle is the dwelling place of the conscious I. The conscious I inhabits the interior castle and lives on the surface of the castle, or learns to journey inward into the depth of the castle. Now, how many of you might be familiar with the doctrine of St. Teresa of Avila? A little bit? No? Let me read a quotation from Stein that will bring this to the foreground. This is how Stein describes the human soul. The soul is the space in the middle of the bodily soulish whole. As a sensitive soul, it dwells in the living body and all its members and parts. It receives from it and has a shaping, preserving effect upon it. As a spiritual soul, it rises above itself, looks out into the world beyond itself, a world of things, persons, and events, and by understanding enters into communication with the world, as well as receiving from the world. But the soul in its most proper sense, it dwells with itself. The I is at home in its soul. Here everything that enters in from the sensory and from the spiritual world is gathered. Here an inner confrontation takes place with what enters into the soul. From here a position is taken upon what enters in, and here is gained what becomes its most personal property, an integral part of its very self, what figuratively speaking becomes its flesh and blood. The soul is an interior castle, and as such, it is a space within which the pure I dwells, a space within which the I can move about, now outward, now inward, ultimately drawing into the depth of the interior. It is not an empty space, even though a fullness can enter into it and be taken up by it. Now, what we find here in this quotation is an Aristotelian and Thomistic understanding of the soul. The soul is the form of the body. That is, the matter of the body is formed by the soul to be one, to be alive, to be an organic and organized whole, and to be the site of the operations of life. And yet the soul doesn't just form the body. The soul also has an inner life. In this inner life, the conscious I dwells. Out of this inwardness, the conscious I engages the world. And when it does engage the world, it receives nourishment from the world. The nourishment of the soul is meaning. The nourishment of the soul in the Greek is logos. The nourishment of the soul is the word. When the soul is nourished, just like when the body is nourished, it incorporates that nourishment into itself. And in this way, the soul grows, develops, and matures through time. It unfolds itself into a castle-like or diamond-like structure according to the image of St. Teresa of Avila. And with this, then, the soul attains maturity. But it can only attain this maturity if it receives nourishment from reality, just like the body can only attain maturity if it does so. And it can only attain maturity if the I learns to dwell in the depth of the soul. So those of you who aren't familiar with St. Teresa of Avila, she speaks about the journey into the depth of the self, the journey into the depth of the soul, the journey into the inner room of the soul. Ultimately, for St. Teresa of Avila, in that inner room, God dwelt. And therefore I encountered God when I went to the bottom of myself, when I went to the depth of myself. Stein adjusts this for us philosophically. She says if we go to the depth of ourselves, we also encounter the world. We encounter the world more deeply. Now, this is an interesting insight because often when we think of going into the self, you think of retracting from the world. So if I just said to you, go into yourself, you'd probably think that that would be a retraction from the world, the exterior world. But for Stein, it's actually the reverse. A kind of telescoping takes place if we live from the depth. If we live on the surface of the self, if I live a shallow life, reality will appear shallow to me. If I'm superficial, the world will be superficial. It'll be to some large degree meaningless to me. But if I learn to live in the depth of myself, then I begin to see the depth of reality. I begin to see the meaningful depth of the world that lies before me. So shallow subjectivity means shallow objectivity. A deep and intense subjectivity means a deeply and densely rich, meaningful world. Now, one of the reasons why this is so for Stein is because when the conscious I engages with the meaning of the world, it takes it into itself as its nourishment. It transforms it into itself, just like the body does. So let's think of the analog of the body here for a moment. The body is a material thing in a material world, and when it nourishes from this material world, it does so by transforming organic matter into itself. And in this way, the body grows, develops, heals, and matures. For Stein, the soul is no less complex. We live in the world as spiritual souls as well as material bodies. The nourishment of the soul is not like the nourishment of the body. The soul is not built up through the course of time by food. Its food, its nourishment is meaning, logos, word. If you're Christian, you can think of this in light of the Gospels. What does Christ say? I live not by bread alone, but I live by every word of the mouth of the Father. Now again, Christ is speaking metaphysically robust in this statement. Christ is not just giving us a significant truth about his relation to the Father. He's teaching us about the structure of what it means to be a person. I live not by bread alone. I live by the word of meaning. I live by the logos of reality, because reality is the word of God. Reality is intelligible, it's meaningful, and as something intelligible, as meaningful, it's like a word spoken by the Creator to us. And we as rational beings can hear that word, and when we engage that word, we take it into us, and our soul grows, develops, heals, and matures. But again, only if I learn to live from the depth, because if I live at the surface, I'll only see the surface of things. If I live at the depth, I'll see the depth of things. Now, I would wager that each of you have had this experience of moments of life living superficially and other moments of life living deeply. I certainly have this experience. I have this daily. This often causes me to live superficially, as does my phone, etc., distractions, whatever. But if I can catch myself, if I can step back, then I can approach reality afresh. Then it has now clear outlines again. It is now vibrant color again. What is the difference here? It's still the same world. I'm still the same rational subject. For Stein, the conscious I has learned to dwell deeply in the depth of the soul. Now we begin to see something of the meaningfulness of this adjustment of the Boethian definition of the person. The person is an individual substance of a rational nature. That's the received Thomistic tradition. Stein adjusts it, an individual substance of a rational nature born by a conscious I. This conscious I has to learn to live in the depth of the personal soul, and then the person will attain its proper maturity, attain its proper completion. Now, in this depth, Stein says that each of us bear a unique qualitative distinctness. There's so much that makes each of you distinct here tonight. We have all been born at a different moment of human history, of different parents, with a different ancestral train. We all have our certain genetic inheritance. We've all lived life through the course of time, and much has happened to us. Our environment has affected us, the material environment and the cultural environment, and your choices have affected who you've become through time. And because of this, all of you are individually unique. Stein says these are certainly manifold bases for our distinctiveness. But for Stein, each of us bear a distinctness given to us singularly by God, a qualitative distinctness of the depth of the soul that makes each of us unique in a strong sense. To be unique is to be one-off. To be unique is to be unrepeatable, because something that is one-off, if it is lost, it cannot be had again. To be unique is to be irreplaceable, because if something is one-off, it cannot be replaced. Now for Stein, we all bear this uniqueness in the depth of the spiritual soul, and it's what makes us who we are, singularly before one another, and who we are singularly before God. But we'll never learn what that uniqueness is unless we learn to live in that depth of the self. Because it is only by living in the depth that this uniqueness begins to come to the foreground of life in all personal expression and activity, and begins to affect how we relate to others. And when we relate to others, Stein proposes to us that a genuine personal encounter will be an encounter with this uniqueness. Not just your male or female, not just your body as differently composed, but rather you at the center of you are different from everyone else. She gives us a wonderful image to think about this. You know the way white light is refracted when it moves through a prism into the spectrum of color? We're all familiar with this through the rainbow. When it rains, the light is refracted through the rain and it spreads out into the spectrum that is the rainbow. Now in English we count 7 colors in the rainbow. How many do you count in German? Is it also 7? Because different language groups can have a different number of colors. Yeah? Why? Because the rainbow has actually got a quasi-infinite number of hues. If you look closely at it, it's really, really refined and rich. So for Stein, we bear the image of God. God is the divine white light, and we bear his image as rational and free, as persons. But then also, she says this divine white light is refracted into a spectrum of qualitative distinctness for all persons through all time in all places. Each of us bear a singular hue of this refraction, and this qualitatively determines the depth of the soul and makes us unique for all eternity before God, in a personal relationship with him, and also with one another. It is arguably that which we fall in love with when we fall in love with another person. It's arguably that which we identify when we identify the uniqueness of another person. It's that thing you can't quite put your finger on. Like if I say to my wife, I love you because this, it's not near as powerful as saying, I love you, full stop. And when I'm asked, well, what is it exactly that you love? You can't really put your finger on it. The reason for this is because if something is properly unique, you can't actually name it with human names. Like there are chairs and tables in this room. We have proper names. Why do we have proper names and the chairs and tables don't? Because there's something more significant about us. But my proper name is shared with all other Roberts, as your proper name is likely shared with many others also. But for Stein, each of us have a proper name. This proper name captures this singular hue of the divine white light refracted in each of us as individuals. And it's what we will come to learn when we enter into his presence. And she cites then the book of Revelation to bring this before us. In chapter 2, verse 17, where we will receive a white stone upon which is written your name, known only to God. Now, for Stein, if we don't learn to live in the depth of the soul, this feature of our being won't ever find the light of day. And therefore we have a real reason from a personal perspective to go to this depth so as to bring to the foreground that aspect of our life. Because we don't want to be a missing color of the rainbow. The rainbow would be a funny thing if there were like hues missing. It would be awful. When you look at a rainbow, you love to see all of the colors stretching together. It's part of the joy and wonder of it. This also makes each person significant no matter what the story of their life. You could be conceived and live just for a day, and you would bear significance because you bear the divine image in a unique way. You could live life very short without ever awakening to rational freedom, and nonetheless bear significance because of this. Now, what I'll do from now on is I'll bring this to some kind of rounded conclusion, and then I'd like to open up for dialogue and questions and comments, because that'll likely be where most of the interesting stuff gets done tonight. because you're a very varied group of people. It was a bad idea to read from the paper, so I'm not sure how much traction anything else I'm saying is getting in you, in your thought. And therefore, I think with your questions and comments, we'll be able to draw a greater shape upon it. So, Stein is a contemporary, philosophically speaking, 20th century. Born in 1890, died in 1942. As Father Patrick mentioned, in Auschwitz-Birkenau. A life cut short, and from many perspectives, an incredibly frustrated life. She was one of the first of her generation as a female to attend university. Then when she did, she achieved doctoral studies in philosophy and wrote 2 habilitations, but wasn't accepted as a university professor, first because she was a woman, and then because she was ancestrally Jewish, ethnically Jewish. Most of her later writings weren't published during her day, again because she was ethnically Jewish. And so her life seems to be profoundly ground down in frustration academically. She also had to abandon her family to enter the Carmelite convent in Cologne, and then eventually her life was taken when the Gestapo came to her convent in Echt in Holland for transportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau. She died before she was even 50, with works left unpublished in her monastery. And yet, because she followed truth as a rational substance, because she learned to live from the depth as a Carmelite sister, she echoes loudly into our day. She echoes loudly into this auditorium tonight. She has invested herself in the tradition of the West, and she has wrought from that wonderful teachings that can help us to understand what it means to be a person. And she's done so as a contemporary who engaged the Catholic tradition with fervor as a ready and reverent pupil. Thank you. It was still about 45 minutes, I think, so that was okay. Any comments, thoughts, questions? Yes. What's your name? Sorry, could you repeat that? Sorry, could you repeat your name? Guido. Thank you.
I have a question about the relationship between this colorful individual, which I understood as being there from the beginning and probably being immortal, and the other part, the conscious I, which need to be feeded. So it could be immortal if it's not feeded.
One can think of these things with analogy. The question is the relationship of the conscious I and the nourishment of the soul, and a question of mortality and immortality.
And there is a difference between the colorful individuals and the conscious I.
Okay. So for the Catholic intellectual tradition of Aquinas and Thomism, because we're spiritual beings and not merely material beings, we have an immortal aspect to our being, an immortal dimension to our being. The materiality of the body is our mortality, and the spiritual composition of the soul is our immortality. Now, this means we're a kind of being that straddles the whole of creation. We're like inanimate objects, we're like living plants, we're like sensate and motile animals, and then we're different from all of these things, bodily things. We're like angelic being, with rationality, freedom, intellect, like God. Now, this aspect of our being, Stein is really, really interested in, and it's captured by that simple word soul. Soul just first means life. How do we find life? We find it in the operations of life. And so for the tradition of Aristotle and Aquinas, The soul is the form of the body. It brings to the body life and all of the operations of life. But then Stein is a contemporary, so she sees the soul as having an interiority to it. And you can think of this as paired with contemporary psychology. There's an inwardness to each of us. We're not merely outward beings, there's an inwardness to us. And it's really hard for us to speak about this inwardness except by using metaphors, because nothing else has this inwardness. Now, this inwardness for Stein is, you could say, anchored or rooted or comes to the light in the conscious eye. The conscious eye is like a luminous pole of our interiority. But our interiority isn't just this luminous pole, it's a spatial reality. And it's not a spatial reality that just has a defined structure, but this defined structure, just like the body, unfolds through time. Now, in the depth of this structure is this quality, this coloration. And Stein proposes to us that we have a responsibility that color radiate throughout the whole of that structure inwardly and eventually through the body, so it can be perceptible in the world, and then there's a defined aspect of our creativity. Just like the spiritual soul in general, this quality is given by God, but I have a responsibility for its actualization in my life. If I awaken to consciousness, I have a responsibility to discover this and learn to live it out from the depth. So there's an eternality about it. It reflects God, but there's also a temporality about it. It's in the world. And we are that kind of being, stretched between God and matter, stretched between the eternal and yet bound into the temporal. So that color is not something we can change, but it's something we bear responsibility to live out into the world, because there will be a loss in the world if it's not lived out, like the loss of a rainbow. Have I addressed your question? Thank you, Guido. Yes, what's your name? Pavel.
Yeah, so I actually have two questions, but maybe I'll just try asking one and then see if there's more time. At the beginning, you mentioned this two ways of apprehension. One was intuitive and one abstractive. And I'm quite interested in that subject, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about it. Would you, for example, say that the difference would be between intuitive, direct grasp of certain objects versus a kind of cognition by making generalized representation of things? And also, would you connect this intuitive grasp to the inner sphere, whereas abstractive grasp to objects in the outer sphere? So just, your thoughts on this.
In relation to the latter first, I wouldn't connect it to inner or outer, and I don't think Stein would connect it to inner or outer. But I can come back around to that at the end. For both phenomenology and Thomism, what we encounter when we think about reality is the essential structure of reality. That is, we encounter essences as the intelligible determination of objects we know. So that's a ground that they share, at least according to the interpretation of Stein. And it seems to me also of Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. What we know when we know reality, in its intelligibility, are essences. Essences determine things as what they are. So when we ask the question, what? The answer in the world is essence. Now, how do we encounter essence? Well, there's a differentiation then between Thomism and phenomenology. Phenomenology, it's an intuition of the essence when we think about the object. For Thomism, it's an abstraction of the intelligible aspect of the essence when we think about the object. Now, either way, they're alighting upon what is essential, invariant, and necessary in the thing thought about, but the way to describe this encounter is different, intuition or abstraction. Now, the reason why phenomenology goes to intuition is because it's not interested in the processes of the real. It's just interested in at least in the Husserlian way, it's interested in unpacking the intelligibility of experience. So all it's interested in is essence. It's not interested in the process of cognition. Thomism and Aristotle are interested in the process. And the process for them is abstraction. The intellect takes the intelligibility and leaves the materiality behind. It takes the generality or the universality and leaves the particularity or individuality behind. Now, it seems to me that you can hold these two things together, and indeed the word intuition is also found in the Thomistic tradition. Arguably, when we understand something, it is an intuitive act. That is, the intellect rests upon the reality understood. So when we think of intuition today in English, I don't know what it's like in German or the equivalent to cognate in German, but we think of it as like a gut feeling. No, intuition is an intellectual act where it encounters something. There's another aspect of this we could explore about existence, and we could maybe come back to that later. So no, for Stein, it's not inner and outer. Whenever we encounter anything, inner or outer, what we know when we know it is its essential structure, and intuition is the seeing of that. Abstraction is the process whereby we lift its intelligibility. What's your name? Will.
Thank you for the lecture, and I'm going to have to leave just a couple minutes, and I don't want you to think it's because I don't like your answer. So I guess I would love to get clear on the nature of your developmental claim in terms of the historical progress and what Stein sees herself as doing. Because, so I'm much more familiar with the older tradition, and in both Aristotle and Aquinas, you might see things that are certainly not the interior eye or the conscious self, but for example, Aristotle seems very clear about the fact that nous or understanding can reflect upon itself, so there's a kind of self-awareness. And then in Aquinas, more than just the form of the body, you have all the talk of the separated soul and all of this sort of very spiritual understanding of what's going on with the person. So I guess basically the question is, do you see Stein's incorporation of the personalist tradition as something that is fully in harmony and compatible with what comes before, drawing out certain elements of it? Or do you think it really is quite revolutionary and would require throwing out elements of the earlier tradition to get a harmonious picture?
In general, I think the latter, that it's a harmonious picture. I think of philosophy somewhat like this. It's saying what we already know with clarity and precision, ideally, and it's therefore drawing to light something that is to some degree hidden or veiled. And so I think of philosophical history like this. The history of philosophy is the unfolding of the intelligibility of reality that we're doing slowly through the course of time with the help of one another. To take the words of Isaac Newton from a scientific perspective, we stand on the shoulders of giants. So it's not Aristotle's fault that he didn't see the conscious eye that Stein saw, or Aquinas's. And as you mentioned in relation to nous, it seems to me that these things are implicit in their thought, though not thematized, not attended to in their thought. Consequently, when we move later in history, with more thinkers standing on their shoulders, more can be seen, more can be drawn to the foreground. And that's how I understand what is called the philosophia perennis, the perennial philosophy. It's a philosophical tradition that's growing slowly through time and ideally expanding, though not without many problems as it moves along. I don't like the idea of philosophy restarting again and again like we find in the modern era, with Descartes, then with Kant, and with many, many further thinkers, and to some degree with Husserl and phenomenology. So I think Stein has come across something new here with the help of phenomenology that's at service to tradition, that can be integrated without a speed bump into the tradition. One of the reasons why I would think so is because we're not only aware of our rational acts, we're aware of our volitional acts. And because of this, it seems to me that this awareness is something that stands behind rationality and volitionality, and therefore isn't embedded in one or the other, like it would be for Aristotle. Nous can reflect upon itself. Yes, reason can do a reflective act, but this awareness is not merely that reflectivity. It captures rationality and will together, and so it seems to me it stands independently of both and is to some degree behind both and is anchored in this conscious I. At least I would argue, but I'd happily take argument against it. Any questions from this side of the audience? The quieter side. Yes, what's your name?
Sorry, my name is
Leopold.
Yeah, there's no subtle way to phrase this. One of the big things that stood out to me was the whole idea that the soul gets its nourishments, from the outside, but the core idea is to go inside. So not to outwards, but to begin inwards. So, and in that context, what value would the tradition give living, like existing in the world?
This is all the questions have been great so far, even though I obviously insulted Will there. But this question is particularly helpful. Father Patrick knows Irish people have a kind of edgy sense of humor, so this question is particularly helpful because we have found ourselves in a funny moment of human history where subjectivity is set opposite objectivity, and in some ways these are seen as antithetical categories. Now, often when this is come at from the perspective of a Christian or a Catholic Christian, we have a great aversion to subjectivity. Why? Because of subjectivism. Subjectivism is when we get lost in subjectivity, and often this shows its face in moral subjectivism, and together with that moral relativism. So we see in the modern era, inaugurated by René Descartes, as a turn to the subject, a problem, because we can get lost in subjectivism. And there are grave consequences when we get lost in subjectivism, particularly in its moral relativistic form. Now, because of that, many contemporary thinkers in the Catholic tradition or Christian tradition have a kind of aversion to subjectivity, or at least an ignoring of it. But it seems to me that this represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what subjectivity is. The clue is in the words. Subject, object. Maybe these words are paired words, picking out paired realities. And it seems to me that that is most certainly the case. What's in the world are things, and these become objects of cognition for who? A personal subject. That is, you only have objectivity when you have subjects. To be a subject is to be directed toward an object. One cannot understand objectivity without subjectivity. And likewise, one cannot understand subjectivity without objectivity. What we have in the world are things and persons. When we set things and persons in relation, what we have are objects and subjects. So, if that's true, if I become more objective, I simultaneously become more subjective. Or if I become more subjective, rightly understood, I simultaneously become more objective. Why? Because to be a subject is to be turned toward the objective. To be an object is to be something for a subject, a cognitive object, a volitional object. So if I live a more intense subjective life, ideally, genuinely, authentically, then the world will be a more objective place for me. If I become more objectively focused, then I will live a more intense subjectivity. So when we decouple these concepts and we decouple the realities, we can get lost in subjectivism, or we can get lost in you could say, a brutish objectivity. Now let's make this more Let's bring this home by a very basic example. In this room, there are many objects. Some of those objects are also personal subjects. You. If I were to try and rush out of the room, just say the fire alarm went, and there was a chair or a table in my way, you'd think it reasonable for me to kick that chair or table out of my way. But you also, as an object, could be in my way. But if I don't pay attention to the fact that you're also a personal subject, and I kick you out of the way, you'd rightly be insulted, you'd rightly be hurt, and you'd rightly think he shouldn't be a professor teaching at any university. Yeah? So if we don't pay attention to the subjectivity of some of the objects of our experience, we've lost what they are. In fact, to think of all other things as mere objects is to be psychopathological. No, in my experience, there are many objects. Some of those are personal subjects, and they're the really important things. And if I pay attention to them and their subjectivity, then I'm paying attention rightly to the world. Let me give you a concrete example. As a father, I can be really distracted and not pay attention to my children or indeed to my wife. However, if I were to look them in the face at a given moment and thereby encounter their subjectivity via its manifest presence in their face, I'm immediately drawn to myself and how to relate rightly to them. That is, I have to become aware of their subjectivity to relate rightly to them, like I would have to become aware of yours to not kick you out of the way if the alarm went. So subjectivity shines in our experience, and rightly so, and isn't a bad thing. Now, have I answered your question, Leopold? Is that what you were getting at?
I think so.
Okay. More thoughts? I'm not sure who's first, but let's let ladies go first. What's your name again? Johanna.
Could you elaborate on the role of meta and specifically the body space in knowledge for Stein?
So for Stein, just like another phenomenologist called Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the body was of great significance. So it's quite interesting when you look at her doctrine of being individual and individuality. She moves away from the body toward the spiritual soul and the personal I, but not because she's got any negation of the body embedded in her understanding. Indeed, her first work was on the problem of empathy, and empathy is an act of cognition whereby we experience the subjectivity of others via their bodies. And as you move through her thought, the body plays a decisive role right throughout her thought. So one could readily say that Stein understands our cognition as embodied cognition, as deeply bodily. Let's think of this in a very ordinary way. If I was a bat in here in this room, the room would appear different to me because I'd be acting by echolocation instead of visual sight. Or if I saw different strands of the electromagnetic spectrum, I'd see the world differently. Like just say I saw infrared and not red. The world would appear differently to me. So our bodies condition our experience of reality and to a large degree determine it. And so when we think of cognition, we ought not to think of it as utterly spiritual or absolutely immaterial. It is an immaterial act, but it's an immaterial act of an bodily being, and it's an embodied act. Just let's think really concretely. I see the room right from here right now. You see the room from right there, in this space, at this moment of time. What's it like for God to see this room, or an angel to see this room? God is not bound to a place. God is not bound to a time. God is not bound to a perspective upon a thing. An angel is not bound to a place, a time, or a perspective. What do I look like to an angel or to God? What do you look like to them? A very, very different experience. God sees you whole and complete through everything that you are, body and soul, throughout the entire course of your life in one simple act of apprehension. That's very different than I'm seeing the front side of your body right now. So for Stein, our intellectual activity is deeply embodied, even though it also transcends the body. Just like our free activity is deeply embodied, even though it transcends the body. Like I couldn't perform an act of love without the body. An act of love is a spiritual act, it's a personal act, it's a choice. But in no way could I affect that act without the body. And so our body is implicated in all of this also. What's your name? Juan.
I'm curious about what's the relationship between Edith Stein's early thought on entity as a phenomenalist with his later commitment to Thomism.
So, somewhat like one of the previous questions in terms of, I think it was Will's question about not finding these things in tradition, the word empathy or Einfühlung shows up quite late in human history and only takes philosophical and scientific shape throughout the 20th century. For us, these words are as if they've always been about and they've always meant something, but they're really recent coinages. Now, certainly St. Thomas understood the experience of others. Certainly Aristotle understood the experience of others, but they didn't put a term upon that or a word upon that. Empathy is the act of perceiving the experience of another. Or more simply, I experience that you experience, and to some degree experience what you experience. Like right now, I see you looking at me. That's an experience of your experience, and that's the act of empathy. So again, like the answer to the previous question, it's an area that just wasn't looked at, is now looked at and drawn into the light, and then fits within the tradition of the philosophia perennis as one part of that tradition now more fully completed. We're all just contributing to human history as we move through time. Unfortunately, she doesn't write about empathy in her later writings, so she doesn't do this work of integration. She rarely repeats herself. By the way, if you need to leave, please feel free. I'll keep answering questions till you stop asking, but don't feel like you have to stay on till the very end of the night. And Father Patrick and I have to go for a pint of Guinness soon as well. Any other questions? More? Yes, what's your name? Santiago.
Maybe you would like to say something about St. John of the Cross? Or I know.
Yes, so when Stein gives up philosophical investigation twice in her life, first after converting to Catholic Christianity, because she wants to give herself over to the service of God. Then through St. Thomas, she realizes she can set herself at the service of God by being at the service of truth, which is what philosophy ought to be, and therefore she takes up philosophical investigation again. Now she gives it up then also when she enters the Carmelite order. Yet, under the direction of her superiors, she continues writing philosophy and produces her last major philosophical work, Finite and Eternal Being, subject to her superior's direction. Now also then she writes a work on St. John of the Cross that remained unfinished as she was arrested and transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. So the last work she writes is called The Science of the Cross. It's a reflection on the writings of St. John of the Cross from a philosophical, theological, and mystical perspective. Now, the title itself is really interesting because science is always general, at least in a traditional understanding. That is to say, the mathematician is not interested in this triangle, but triangularity. The physicist is not interested in this object falling according to gravity, but gravity. Now Stein then puts before us this science she calls the science of the cross, while also recognizing that it's something we each and can only explore individually. That is to say, though I can sympathize with your suffering, I can't partake in your suffering as such. Suffering is something each of us does as individuals. We can empathize with suffering of one another. We can sympathize with the suffering of one another. We can have compassion for one another. But we can't actually take the suffering of one another. That is, when just think of it in an ordinary way, when you have a toothache, I can't feel your pain. When you grieve, I can't feel your grieving. But there is a kind of science that we learn under the tutelage of Christ, who does enter into our suffering, whose suffering we can enter into, and this science we learn as individuals. For Stein, it is this science that makes us whole and complete, that makes us mature. And this is the science of the cross. It's really interesting. Our relationship with God is rendered unique and interpersonal in many ways, but no more unique and interpersonal than it is through the Passion, through his suffering and through ours. This is why there's something spousal about Christ's love for humanity, Christ's love for the church, and we see this in the letter to the Ephesians chapter 5. His redemption is a spousal love. It's a suffering love, but it's also a spousal love. It's for the individual. It's a choice of the individual. It's an exclusive kind of love for each individual. Any more questions? Leopold has another.
Yeah, because you mentioned now a second time, like the process of the soul maturing, and how far should we actually, how much maturity do we actually want for our soul? Because as I understand it, we have this core, which is like the unique hue of each person, and everything else. And I'd assume that a fully mature soul would be just that hue, completely unobstructed, shining through and everything. But how much of myself do I actually find in the other parts, like the castle around that?
Yeah, so for Stein, the ultimate determinant of our uniqueness is that quality that we have before us under the metaphor of color, that we each have a singular hue. But there are many other bases of our distinctness, including bodily bases like our genetic inheritance, our lived experience, our actions and stuff. And so the soul has many dimensions of uniqueness or distinctness about it. She speaks about three: the quality, the openness of the soul, and the power of the soul. And you can think of openness and power as tied to this interior castle, as descriptors of this interior castle. And as we unfold that castle through the course of time, we become more uniquely ourselves. Now, it's worth reflecting upon this in relation again to the Second World War. Father Patrick and I were talking about another German philosopher over coffee just before this talk, Hannah Arendt. Now, she reported on the Nuremberg trials subsequent to the Second World War, and in consequence coined this phrase, the banality of evil. Have you heard that phrase before? I don't know what it is in German, the banality of evil. Through repeated exposure to the crimes of the Second World War, she came to understand evil as banal, and as the protagonists involved in perpetuating this evil also as banal. Evil came to look the same in each of its protagonists. The protagonists came to look the same through their evil actions. Now, if we contrast this with, let's say, the height of goodness, and in the Western tradition, the height of goodness is captured by saintliness. In the Catholic tradition, we have these canonized saints, and we look at their lives, and we look at their persons, we see incredibly individual characters. Characters who've become incredibly unique, like Saint Benedict and Saint Dominic, Saint Bonaventure and Saint Thomas, Saint Francis and Saint John Bosco, Pope Saint John Paul II and Pope Pius X. These characters have nothing banal about them. And so it seems to be that when we live out of this depth authentically, and the soul unfolds properly before a meaningful world as the Word of the Father, we become more fully ourselves through the course of time. Now, I don't know if there's an upper limit to that. The lower limit is the banality of evil, where you become a cookie-cutter version of evil. What's the upper limit? Well, we see it differently arrayed in the saints of the Western tradition and the Eastern tradition. Now, here's something maybe theologically controversial. It seems to me that we'll work something of this out in purgatory if we haven't worked it out here. God wants us whole and complete for eternity, and therefore maybe some aspect of this will have to be worked out after our bodily death if it hasn't been worked out during the course of our lives. But that's just a speculation. Like purgatory maybe isn't all bad. In Ireland, we've got this place called St. Patrick's Purgatory, which is a pilgrim site where you do penance for 3 days. Us Irish people love penance, at least historically. Any more thoughts, comments, or questions? One more from Guido.
So you mentioned this metaphor of philosophy being something like the glasses that help us to see reality more clearly, to see the boundary of things more well-defined, better defined. And one area, I think, in which today those boundaries are very blurred is the area of artificial intelligence, animal rights, and just disputes about what actually counts as a conscious subject and what doesn't. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how, well, maybe phenomenologists in the tradition of Edith Stein approach those controversies, and whether this idea of the conscious I is something like a standard by which we can set the boundary of what is a person and should have rights and so on, and what doesn't. So.
Yeah, excellent question and very historically pertinent, and to some degree relates to the previous question by Will again. Whether we look at it from the perspective of rationality or consciousness, it seems to me that we have a clear basis for distinguishing persons from all other realities. And the reason for this is quite simple. Materiality is always parts outside parts. That is to say, matter lies alongside other matter, and its relation to other matter is its lying alongside it and their various forces operative. So matter has a kind of externality to it. Now, when you come to consciousness or rationality, you find something different. It's not opaque like matter, it's transparent. It's not outside itself like matter, it's in itself. That is to say, I know Pavel asked me a question, and I know that I know that Pavel asked me a question. I'm aware of Pavel, and I'm aware that I'm aware of Pavel. Like, that experience is really interesting. I'm in my consciousness, in my awareness of you, I'm in my knowledge of you. I not only know you, I know that I know you. Matter doesn't do this. That is to say, matter doesn't have presence to the other while remaining present to itself. It doesn't have awareness come self-awareness. Consciousness come self-consciousness. Rationality about the object, rationality about rationality. So there's an inward transparency and inward reflexivity to consciousness and rationality, and matter just simply doesn't give us that. And this means that the word artificial intelligence, it seems to me, is itself problematic because it's not intellect, and therefore that word intelligence has been used analogously, if properly at all. And then when you look at animal cognition, you have to then also separate that. And one of the ways you can separate that is you can look at it from the perspective of the way we deal with generalities, whereas animals are bound down to particularities, different animals in different ways. But what we have in this personal reality that we are, according to the dignity of our being, whether we consider it according to rationality or consciousness, we have this presence to the other while present to self. Now, let's finish with this thought. Or maybe there'll be another question. In the Gospels, in all 4 Gospels, to a total of 6 times, Christ in various different formulations tells us that we must lose ourselves to find ourselves. You're familiar with these sections of Scripture? Now, here, again, he's speaking metaphysically robust. He's not just speaking about the sacrifice of life when we love others. He's saying what it means to be a person is to be with the other without losing the self. In fact, if I'm more with the other, I become more fully myself. If I give myself to the other, I become more fully myself. This is the nature of spirit. In the words of Pope Benedict Ratzinger, great German theologian and philosopher, spirit pours itself forth while remaining wholly with itself. Like if I poured this water forth now, it'd be gone. Matter, if poured forth, is empty. But spirit is present to the other while present to the self. And this is what you find in consciousness, and this is what you find in rationality. And therefore, I don't think matter can give us these things. I don't think you'll ever have an artificial intelligence properly so called. Persons will always be distinct and unique. They'll always be creations of the Creator. I said that was the last question, but the gentleman at the back has a question, so I want to attend to that. What's your name?
My name is Marcus.
Marcus.
I spoke about the finality of the evil. And 80 or 90 years ago in Germany, the definition of a person, of the worth of a person, the dignity of a person, was different as we see it, as the Christians see it. And they said they are not rational beings, they are not conscious, they are not self-conscious, they are not able to get in a relation to other persons. And these persons, handicapped, very, very happy, exist still. And in what does the dignity, the worth of a person consist?
So the ancient definition that I introduced at the beginning of Boethius, when originally formulated by him, in English goes something like this: an individual substance of a rationable nature. Now, often when we have it in Latin or English today, or in various other translations, it's an individual substance of a rational nature. So rational versus rationable. That is, a rational capacity. The dignity is found in the rational capacity, not in the exercise of that capacity. The same with consciousness. To be a conscious subject is not necessarily to ever have awoken to consciousness, but it's bearing a nature with that capability, even if that nature is stunted by being frustrated early in life through some impediment, or if it's stunted by being cut short in life. Once you have a being in actuality, an individual substance, bearing this nature, whether it exercises ever or not, that's a person, and as a person, a being of dignity. That is a value that we can't put a price upon. Now, you're right in the way you spoke at first in highlighting that it took us time through human history to get to this understanding. And it is something crafted in the Western tradition very slowly through time, and is something that we should be we should be greatly reluctant to lose. We really have to, it seems to me, understand this anchor of the moral life, of the political life, and this anchor of the moral and political life is the person and their dignity. let's capture this in a very simple way. It's kind of morbid, sorry, it's a bad way to finish a talk. Would you prefer to be murdered or be a murderer? Like me, I think you're reacting. I would not want to become a murderer. I would prefer to be murdered. This is really interesting, and it captures very well for us this sense of personal dignity and its nexus in our freedom. We would see that we would undo ourselves if we acted in such a way. We would act against our own dignity. And it would be better to be murdered than to act against my own dignity in that way. And in the Catholic tradition, this is like the centerpiece of intrinsic evil. Acts we can never perform, because should we perform them, we act against ourselves in a really decisive way. You can't unmake yourself as a person, but you can act against what it means to be a person. And to use our freedom in such a way would be to act against what it meant to be a person. And then Stein is a great example. She allowed herself to be murdered rather than take part in anything that was happening because of the truth of the creation and the truth of the human person. Thank you.